UNISA is one of those iconic institutions in the country. Whenever you feel like, oh God, I should be studying Russian or Greek or Swahili or Ndebele, I'm sure UNISA will have it. In fact, yesterday I was with a lecturer in the Michaela School of Fine Art, and she said, she really wishes that she had done philosophy or English. And she said, well, yeah, I think I'll do it through UNISA. So, I come from the Western Cape, and where, the teaching fraternity basically got their education, their higher education, through doing UNISA long-distance degrees. So I may still come to register for something like Greek or Russian, if you still have them by the time I'm going to do them. Now, we can talk about many crises at all levels of education. I mean, we have crises at all levels, including the massive crisis in skills, in the shortage of plumbers and electricians and builders and mechanics and so on. And this, in fact, the humanities are implicated in this. I've become very interested in craft through some work I'm doing in the history of Cape Town, which I do. And I've been speaking to people in various aspects of the life of the motoring industry in the Western Cape. And it's just amazing the lack of interest in people applying to become formally trained auto mechanics. It sounded to him, when I was having a discussion with this man at the Cape Town College, it sounded to me as if he was talking about the humanities. So we're complaining about a situation, and really people in all sectors have stories to tell about shortages, crises, throughputs, etc., etc. Now, I think you've had enough detail about these reports. I've also sat for a number of years through various meetings and sessions talking about these two reports and in formulating aspects of them. So I don't want to go through them again, so I won't mention them directly. I want to land up, though, talking about the recommendations I received from UNISA much more directly. But I want to tell you two stories about the humanities that I've been experiencing in the last few months or so. And the one is, of course, the situation in Mali and Timbuktu, because I've been involved for the last decade in a massive project on manuscripts in that country and in that city. And in the last couple of weeks, the city has been occupied. There was concern about the manuscript libraries and collections. And of course, what happens, the media contacts you. And here, this was a fantastic education in what the humanities can and cannot do, and which humanities programs do best and don't do well at all. Because I've spoken to dozens of journalists from all over the world. Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, National Public Radio, British Broadcasting Corporation, German papers, French, you name it, SABC, 706, etc., etc. And I made judgments about these services and went to look up some of these journalists who interviewed me, and you can get their CVs and so on, descriptions on the websites and so on. The best interview I had was with a journalist from the Royal Dutch Radio, Netherlands Broadcasting Corporation. And it turned out that Michiel Hubink, the name of the journalist, was doing a PhD in Arabic literature. And we had the most detailed discussion, and he had subsequently wrote the two most detailed articles for the website of the radio service, based on the fact that he has very intimate knowledge. Even though he was working on the Sudan and Arabic in the Sudan, he could have that discussion. The other interesting interview came from a German journalist who was also very thorough. The British journalist and the Canadian journalist, whilst not I couldn't figure out what they had studied, but their thoroughness was reflected in the fact that we had had 3 or 4 conversations before we went live. So it was preparation, it was penetrating, there was skepticism, there was sympathy, a whole range that reflected a fantastic education, a critical education. They were just not taking what I was saying, and they were also going to give me the time, and we had prepared well. Unfortunately, the worst interview was with South African journalists. With the SABC morning show, I was called up, no preparation, no prior conversation as to what I was going to talk about. I went on immediately. Fortunately, it was on time. It was 10 to 8 or something. They actually phoned me 9 minutes to 8, so I can. The other station, which was a private station, phoned me. I was scheduled to speak to them at 3 o'clock, phoned me at 4 minutes past 3. And they said, can you wait for another 10 minutes? I just said, I can't wait. I had a meeting in any case. So this is a story about the present, the contemporary, and the ability of people to have a conversation. This notion of conversation, and in the one report we call it communication, is so central to what we do in the humanities. And as to how we produce a public sphere, informed and so on and so forth. Critical, sympathetic yet critical and skeptical at times and so on. The SAPC conversation that I had was virtually the same conversation I had had with them about 6 years earlier. There was absolutely no difference in the quality of the conversation. Now, this is the one story that I want to tell you. The other one, briefly, is about also an area of interest that I have, and that is, of course, on the Arab Spring. Now, if you look at what has been produced on the Arab Spring, I'm quite amazed by the failure of the humanities to understand what was going to happen in the region. The failure of the disciplines such as political science. You know, what they say, any discipline that calls itself a science is not a science. Oh, you don't call itself a science anymore. Anyway, the thing is the failure of the disciplines. I wrote a short piece about what I found to be the most informative book on the events in Egypt, at least. And this was a compilation of journalism, again journalism, written over 5 years by an Egyptian novelist called Ala al-Aswani. And I think it was called The State of Egypt or something. Every essay, every newspaper piece that is reproduced here in Aswani's collection ends with the slogan, democracy is the solution. If anybody was reading Aswani's journalism for the past 5 years in Egypt or in translation, you would have known something is badly wrong and something is going to happen. It's just so clear. The fact is, Aswani is a novelist by night. During the day, he pulls people's teeth. He's a dentist. So some of our best insights are coming from this dentist who writes novels. So here we have the fact that you don't need a humanities education. You don't need a humanities training, in fact, to offer insights and perspectives. In fact, included in my project on the manuscripts is a chemical engineer who has an interest in African history and is interested in methods of dating paper. So at the institute where I am at UMA, our first activity was a cross-university conversation on being human in our disciplines. So we got together geneticists and neuroscientists and everybody. In fact, I had never thought of this question in my own discipline, what being human means in the discipline of history. So just 2 stories then that reflects on the quality of our public discourse, on our understanding of the world, and how a good or a poor or a no humanities education can affect the way we see the world. Now, with regard to the reports, as I said, I'm not going to talk about them in any detail. Peter Vale and Shireen Hassam have spoken eloquently. I identify very much with the perspective of Professor Hassam, having taught until 18 months ago undergraduate history and seen all the problems. I always say that we started off by prescribing full books. We're nearing the situation where sometimes we have to show people this is an article and this is a book. At some of our best universities, because there's just the culture of reading is just suffering, and we're all suffering with that. But I want to raise how these reports fit into our understanding of the continent. I think sometimes we see ourselves living off the continent. South Africa, the world beyond the Limpopo being something very different, something other. And we actually have extremely little experience of the world beyond our borders. That for many of us, it's a world that's a large flyover zone to England or to the US or elsewhere. Yet, there are grounds for us to be far more deeply concerned with this continent, to be far more interested in comparative histories. I mention histories because I'm a historian by training, and to network much more on the continent. Now, there's a fear that when we raise the word Africa or talk about Africa, that we immediately fall into essentialism. There's something in Africa, or that we're talking black, we're talking color. And I want to say that this is not what I mean at all. Vast parts of the continent are not black. And when I talk of the continent, I'm not talking of black Africa or make a division between the north of the continent and the south of the continent, or the north of the continent, the Sahara, and then the sub-Saharan region. So my first point I want to make is, how do we think of these reports in relation to our location on the continent? We keep having to come back to this because we actually just run away from it more often than not. And so what we do, we say, well, we have so many African courses, we name institutes with the word Africa, we coin terms like Afropolitanism, it's just not, and they don't take us any further. Firstly, I want to admit that it is extremely difficult to work on the continent for many of us. I know from my work in Timbuktu. I know from my work with colleagues in Egypt and elsewhere. Thus, when I come back from parts of Africa or India or elsewhere, I just say things are working so well in our universities. Can you imagine a university with 250,000 students? That is Cairo University. Where I have colleagues whose children go to Cairo University and they just say they've never seen the inside of a lecture theatre. So people get degrees without having actually attended lectures. There's a whole parallel system of tutoring and getting people through degrees. So it's extremely difficult. I don't want to say, well, we're just lazy or anything. It's extremely difficult given the nature of institutions on the continent, given language differences, given crises, such as those in West Africa now, Libya, Egypt, flares in any of these places can affect our research. But I think unless we start to develop these long-term engagements in understanding, our understanding will not deepen, our networks will not deepen. I estimate that you need about a decade of concrete working on projects with colleagues and students in places outside South Africa if you're going to make any headway in terms of establishing real working relations. And really a decade is not long. So my plea for us is to look at what we are doing in relation to the rest of the continent. Professor Neocosmos made this point and invoked Dar es Salaam in the 1980s. Well, we don't need to always go back to the 1980s. There are young scholars, there are pockets of excellence. Admittedly, many people leave for the US or for Europe, but there are still, in my experience, exciting and interesting things happening, except that we don't encounter them in the journals that we feel we need to be reading, except that we don't read them in books published by Routledge or Palgrave or Duke or Princeton. You know, we have a way of saying, of doing things like, invoking my region again, Cape Town, Western Cape, if you want to work on, say, the colored question. Comparative work. Let's look at Brazil. Let's look at the American South. You can find comparisons on this continent. There are people, to use this terrible term, mixed race, on the continent. There are similar questions around the whole question of the Berber and the Arab in the Sahel and the Sahara. There's a way in which we are saying always it can be done with India, it can be done with Brazil, it can be done with the US. You know, there's a way to avoid working on the continent. This will become relevant later on when I speak about the UNISA initiatives. But I just want to stress this. I don't think we need to be Afrocentrists. I don't think we need to be to pursue a line of indigenous knowledge systems to be doing this. But it does mean making concerted effort and knowing that results and outputs and so on will take much longer than what we do when we work in South Africa only. I mean, as an historian, we have a marvelous archival system, a fantastic, the state of conservation, the way in which you can access sources online, not see full sources, but know what is available. I can see why people are spoilt by just working on South Africa. But unless we have a few scholars who make the move and say, we're going to work elsewhere on the continent, we're going to remain, as one of the reports says, as a kind of parochialism in our scholarship. When we do comparative work, it is comparative work with the rest of the Commonwealth. It's Australia, it's Canada, or it's on areas that we feel is now sexy and cool, India, Brazil, and there's a continuous avoidance. We use the question of language as an excuse. I'll come back to that. Well, languages are there to be learned. Shireen spoke about American scholars who come here. We all had to learn languages when you go to overseas graduate schools. And I know colleagues who said, you have to learn Portuguese if you're going to do it. So you're never going to work on Portuguese, on Angola or on Mozambique, because you don't want to start learning Portuguese. Or Swahili, whatever the case may be, in northern Mozambique and in Tanzania. So the other set of issues is with regard to the South. Now, we call it the Global South, at least I call it the Global South, because for a long time, when you looked at the South or the Third World, all that they could offer, all that we could offer was local knowledge, the native informant, nothing beyond the local. And therefore, in my understanding, is that these areas of the so-called Third World, developing world, the South, is involved in another form of knowledge production that is as global as anything else, that it can be picked up, used, critiqued, communicated, and not just the native informant local knowledge that was the case in the South. Now, here I want to say, despite having said in a moment ago, well, we want to go to the cool and sexy places like India and Brazil, that in fact there is much to learn from those places and elsewhere in the South. In one of the UNISA submissions, there was a hint that, well, why is this a concern for us when the academics in those countries actually want to go to the north? There would be little conditions for us to communicate with them, given that their interest is elsewhere. The fact is that there are many influential institutions and intellectuals and publishers that are interested in Africa, in South Africa, and in working across the South. In 2005, President Lula da Silva had a law passed in the Brazilian parliament, the first law of its kind that I know, a law that proclaimed the teaching of history, of African history, as necessary in each university in Brazil. This was amazing. I got invitations to apply for jobs. I said, I'm Portuguese, not very good, no Portuguese. But can you believe there's a law that said you must teach African history in the universities? They're still battling to find people good enough, because the Brazilians, Sao Paulo was founded by the French in the 30s. The Brazilians teach history as if, firstly, they teach European history, and then they teach Brazilian history. I mean, there are other comparable places that also stand with their backs to their continent. This is Argentina has this problem. Parts of Brazil has this problem. So there are pockets of excellent institutions and individuals who are prepared and willing to work with us, and with conditions very similar to us, with questions very similar to ours. We also have a question of the diaspora. Massive diasporas across the Atlantic world, but also in the Indian Ocean world, that should make issues of studying these societies very interesting to us. The Indian Ocean has become a huge growth area of study. Which links the Western Indian Ocean coastal areas from Mozambique up to Somalia, with Yemen, with South Asia and Indonesia. So there's also the question, of course, of diasporas inside Africa. Lebanese, Syrian communities since the late 19th century on the continent. All sorts of other smaller communities, Greek communities. If you want to do Sudanese history seriously for the 19th century, you have to take very seriously that one of the biggest diasporic communities in the capital was Greek. It was a Greek community, and you have to read lots of Italian. So there are other communities on the continent as well. We, of course, have our own experience here with Irish communities and Scottish communities and so on, other diasporas who have settled here. And we have South Asian diasporas all over the continent. So there's a basis for us to work and to make our institutions of excellence on areas other than South Africa, on areas outside the continent, and in the first instance, very much about the continent. I was telling Peter, around the question of Timbuktu, it's a fascinating shift. It wasn't Northwestern or Illinois at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, or any of the well-known African studies institutions that were contacted when this crisis hit Mali and Timbuktu. They came to us. Now, of course, in the first place, they shouldn't be coming to us. They should be going to Mali. But there's a language problem. So it's a francophone world. In fact, I have on my desk a list of 8 telephone numbers. These are the people in Mali. Then I get the response, we've tried, don't speak English, we need an English speaker. But how can we shift this, the terrain? Africa is the only continent where knowledge about the continent is produced in the main of the continent. May be different for South Africa, it may be different for Egypt because of Arabic, but Senegalese history, I need to be corrected. But for our knowledge of the continent, especially historical knowledge of the continent, it's fascinating. You have to go elsewhere. We can't do it. At least we can start to say we're going to begin doing this in South Africa. We have so many excellent scholars from elsewhere in the continent working with us. We have Senegalese scholars, we have Malians, we have Nigerians. When are we going to begin to create projects with scholars about societies and issues outside South Africa? Now, with regard to the UNISA initiatives, I thought there was concern there. There was alignment. Some people reflected alignment, but there was also skepticism. One thing I didn't see in the UNISA submissions was about content. I don't know what the curriculum actually looks like. Look, we can say we're going to study Africa. It means nothing actually, because you can have an African studies program imported from Indiana or Michigan. This is what happened at a leading university in South Africa some years ago, about a decade or so ago, where they produced an African studies course for used across the university. It was seen as a major breakthrough. Engineers were going to do this. They took a book which was produced at Indiana with not a single African author in. There was no African scholar on the reading list. So you can have an African studies program. You can do African history without thinking that there are scholars doing African history seriously on the continent. So that was an absence that it would have been interesting. I would still like to see what is taught as African history, what is taught as African politics, if you divide your fields up in that way. I mean, I don't know. There was no detail in the. You can just tell me when I need. There was no detail in the submissions with regard to the expertise outside South Africa in your faculty here. How many people have capacity or to teach Francophone African literature or history or any aspect of the humanities that is not born out of conditions in South Africa? And if there are very few or you feel you don't have enough, you can always retool. You can, if you have a passion to work on the Sahara, or I don't know why there's this failure of confidence sometimes in South Africa to say we're going to do a major project, far from on Ethiopia or something. There's just no. If you're going to have to retool with languages, you have to learn Italian, you have to learn Amharic or these things. These languages are there to be learned. So we go on decade after decade, and you could easily have mastered some of these languages. So I need to know, one of the things that the dean or the vice principal could do, is to find out really what is, in terms of our humanities, how far do we have expertise in areas that is really global, that is really African. I mentioned the study of language and languages, and this comes up often in your documents. I think this has been mentioned so often. I think what we should do is say nobody who's doing an MA on a region of South Africa, just start with South Africa, should be allowed to proceed without having studied 1 year of the language relevant in that region. If you're going to work on the Eastern Cape, you should do 1 year of Xhosa. If you're going to work on a Venda-speaking area, the students should do 1 year of that language. This is what happens in PhD programs elsewhere. I'm astounded when I meet Chinese, which is what I met in Morocco earlier this year, a Chinese student who had mastered French because of Morocco, who was beginning to learn Arabic and beginning to work on Timbuktu and Mali. It could be that we live in this comfortable Anglo world that the world is trying to learn English and we shouldn't be doing anything else. So I want to stress that we need to make bold decisions about how we're going to really, empower our students with languages so that when they talk as experts in a field of South African history or African history, they actually, at least at the beginning, modestly say, we've done 1 year and we're continuing. I have colleagues from Norway to China who are struggling with either Arabic or Swahili, or even 2 weeks ago, a South Korean scholar struggling with his Afrikaans. I think that we can't leave it up also. The promotion, I think a submission from the African languages, there was a special submission. We can't leave it up to wait on government initiatives. I wrote a little book published by the HSRC Press on Arabic in KwaZulu, initiative in KwaZulu-Natal by Gujarati men who established in the 50s an organization. They had no Arabic. The existence of Arabic as a discipline in South African universities is largely due to a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, a couple more teachers, and a few aunties who could make lots of good food and so on. These people slowly, and then they politicked and so on. I don't know if you have Sesotho as a language here, where is the black bourgeoisie, Sotho-speaking bourgeoisie putting their money to promote this language? There's not a single Sotho newspaper. I had this discussion, in fact, at the meeting of the Charter of Humanities, when we were sitting around and all these guys were complaining in Venda, why is there embarrassment, why we don't do it? You're going to have to do this through civic initiatives. And we have enough money now to do this. And I don't know if you're looking for an Ndebele lecturer, find out who are the Ndebele capitalists to sponsor a lectureship. This is what these guys did in Natal in the 50s. So it has to come from the bottom up. It has to come from the new upper middle classes who demand these things. I mentioned some of these things already in relation. Okay. I think that one of the things I didn't see in the submissions was about UNISA and the communities around it. Now, this may be very difficult for you, but you do have communities around you here and elsewhere in your satellite campuses and so on. When I started in this new institute at Cape Town, one of the things we did, or we did two things. We established this thing called the Cape Town Commons, where we have regular quarterly public discussions around questions of public importance, such as the lottery, for instance. To who does Cape Town belong? Big public fora on questions of significance. And secondly, a public education program with a labor education group called ILRIG, called Know Your City. Because we need to engage with our publics. So I saw nothing about this. I am convinced that there are constituencies of passion, of people passionate about the humanities, if we engage with these communities. From our Know Your City, unbelievable interest by unemployed workers, pavement dwellers, shack dwellers, asking, we produce readers beforehand, we get the best lecturers to come and talk to them. and to engage, not to talk down, but to engage. So we need to, what the university has is a form about social engagement. And it's actually kind of formulaic. So it just says, you can speak to a group of old upper-class ladies from the leafy side of town. That will go as in community engagement. I think we need to be honest about it and work with the real constituencies that need not to be given anything, but that will benefit, and we will also grow through this engagement. Finally, I think UNISA is at a fantastic place in being a long-distance educational institution, because so many of the top universities are at least partly going this way. There's going to be a huge battle for subscription, for money, for adherence to courses by the Oxbridges, the Harvards, and these things in years to come. I don't know whether you know the landscape, but in things like languages, in so many areas, we already know that there is this distance learning component in some of the best institutions. Some of them have the courses on iTunes. I don't know. I haven't seen any UNISA courses on iTunes. I haven't seen public lectures. A thing like this should be available on iTunes. And I get a fantastic education at night by downloading some lectures from Berkeley and whatever I want from Stanford or whoever has it. At the moment, it is only, they are the institutions that are putting the materials up. But it's far more sophisticated. And I think the Chinese are going to do this as they do this always, with huge amounts of capital and to capture huge numbers of people. So those are my modest observations and recommendations, and thank you very much.